Here we are for our first big reading wrap-up of the year. Today I am going to be reviewing all of the books I read from January to March. I read a total of 9 books, 3 books per month. Get comfy, I'm gonna go through each one in detail, so let's jump into it. The first book I read this year was The Two Towers by J.R.R. Tolkien. This is the second book in the Lord of the Rings series, and of course, this is the fantasy book. I gave it 4.75 stars. Obviously, because this is the second book in the series, I will give you more of my thoughts on the book rather than a plot synopsis to avoid spoilers. This book has 2 parts. We are following one group for the first part and the other group for the second part. I can't tell you much about the specifics of our 2 groups without spoiling a bit of the end of Fellowship of the Ring, so you will just have to bear with me. Let's look at the first half and our first group. I liked certain elements from this first half. For example, I loved the new characters we got, like Treebeard and the Ents. I love this idea of a legion of slow-moving tree entities that have immense power, but it just takes them so long to do anything, and they really need the right motivation to mobilize. The first half also has the allegedly iconic Battle of Helm's Deep. Helm's Deep to me was hard to follow. The movement of the characters, the battle conditions were pretty difficult for me, a regular person unversed in battle strategy, to follow. I kind of gave up on the specific movement of the characters and just kind of went with the vibe, which was fine. I just think we needed some kind of map with the movement of the troops to fully figure out what's going on in that scene. When I mentioned that I was reading that chapter to my fiance, he got super excited and said that apparently it's a really good scene in the movie and it's really iconic, and he is super hyped for me to see it. So maybe that'll change my opinion of the chapter. I did like the character dynamics in this chapter, like between the characters during the battle, how they bounced off each other and brought a little bit of levity to a pretty heavy situation. Now, the second half of the book and the second group. This is where the book shines, in my opinion. Plot-wise, we are mostly back to walking and talking, but it's the dynamics and the imagery in this half that really takes the center stage and pushes this book up towards the 5-star mark. The second half is dark. Our characters are going through it. Despair is probably the main emotion being experienced in the second half, but it adds so much depth to the book. It gives us space to look at the symbolism around the ring. The ring slowly wears down the wearer, making them despondent. The mere possession of this power is enough to drag the bearer into depression. I really like this second half, which is apparently a less popular opinion. I won't say unpopular opinion, just less popular. There were certain parts that really stood out to me, like the dead marshes, for example. Hello, Nightmare Fuel. Just know I will be finishing the series and I really recommend it. Next, I read With Love from Cold World by Alicia Thompson. This is a romance book and I gave it 3.75 stars. This book is set in a tourist destination, Cold World, in Orlando, Florida. You can see the irony there. First, we have Lauren Fox, who is the bookkeeper in Cold World. She's very uptight and arguably robotic in how she conducts herself. Then we have Asa Williamson, who also works at Cold World. He is a sarcastic prankster who has worked at Cold World pretty much longer than any other employee at this point. As we start the book, Cold World is not doing well. When the characters think of tourist destinations in Orlando, Cold World doesn't exactly, make the top 10 list. Lauren and Asa, along with another character, Daniel, are chosen to propose ideas on how to revitalize Cold World and bring more people in. This is quite tricky for our characters because you see, Lauren and Asa do not like each other. They have conflicting personalities, at least at first, and they've had one or two uncomfortable run-ins by the time we start the book. So this competition to save Cold World essentially adds a bit of rivalry to that already tense dynamic. From there, we get them getting closer, etc., etc. This book definitely attempts to address some deeper topics than just romance. The characters have some real family issues covered throughout the book. We also have some bisexuality representation, which is good to see. But all in all, this is your classic romance novel. I sped through this book, like I read this very quickly. I think it was quite a nice January read because it was cold out and it was nice to get all cozy while reading the book. I will commend the author for giving us fresh, unique characters. I can only read about the tall, dark and handsome main male character so many more times, right? Asa was a breath of fresh air in that regard. And Lauren too, like she was pretty distinct herself, almost like an up-to-date, newer version of the type A woman archetype. I think this book was marked as enemies to lovers. I don't really agree with that. Maybe miscommunicating co-workers to lovers. Enemies to lovers doesn't really work in non-fantasy settings, in my opinion. Like, what do you mean you have an enemy in your office job? Grow up, Sandra, or just get a life. But anyway, a nice holiday read. Next, I read Water Moon by Samantha Soto Yambao. This is a magical realism book and I gave it 3.75 stars. I have had an interesting journey with magical realism books. I feel like they can be a bit hit or miss. I read Before the Coffee Gets Cold a few years ago and liked it enough. It was okay, standard 3 stars. Then I read The Dallergut Dream Department Store last year and I feel like I regained my whimsy, my sense of childlike wonder. Because of that, I decided to keep going in the genre. And that's what led me to Water Moon. In this book, on a back street in Tokyo, there lies a pawn shop that can only be found by people who need it. You see, to the average person, there is a ramen restaurant there. And when certain people pass through the door of that ramen restaurant, they end up in the pawn shop where they can pawn away their life choices and their biggest regrets. Working in this pawn shop is Hana Ishikawa and her father. This book kicks off when Hana is officially taking over as the owner of the pawn shop. She comes down the stairs on the morning of her first day and her father is missing. The place is in disarray and the door is wide open. In comes a handsome stranger. Together, Hana and this stranger travel through this world to try and find her father. The fantastical elements in here are so fun. For example, you can travel by jumping through puddles. You can listen to candles to hear prayers. You have your entire future tattooed on your body. But there are also ugly parts of this world. We have a pretty spooky set of antagonists pursuing our main characters throughout the book, adding to those stakes. This book tackles grief and regret and may even have you thinking about your own life choices. I do recommend the book. I had a great time. Like most readers, I have a fairly vivid imagination, and so the imagery in here really made the reading experience so fun. Where the book maybe fell down a little bit would be the characters and the pacing. I liked the characters, I liked the dynamic between them, but they did feel a bit one-dimensional sometimes. I didn't buy the instant connection they had, but I was rooting for them. Also, the pacing could go astray. It sometimes felt like we were just jumping from scene to scene in order to get to a new whimsical, magical thing. I was okay with it though, but it may annoy some readers. And that was Water Moon. Next, I read Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. This is a classic novel and I gave it 4.5 stars. I'm sure you all know what Wuthering Heights is. I read this because I wanted to finish it in time for the movie. Did I go see the movie? No. but the intent was there. I also quite like keeping up with commentary online and discussions just to be involved. So I read this book and I loved it. Obviously this is classic, so that's not a super niche opinion in general, but in my personal circle, that is an unpopular opinion. This story follows Catherine Earnshaw and Heathcliff from when they were children into their adulthood. Something that's really interesting about this book is how it's told. We get Cathy and Heathcliff's story, but through third parties. Much of the story is told from the point of view of a servant called Nellie, who knew them for the entire time. The thing about this structure is we are entirely at the mercy of Nellie's 1, memory, and 2, biases. We are getting such a biased account of this story. The whole time I was reading this, I was acutely aware that there should be nuance to how I interpret these characters because of Nellie's opinions. There's that layer of assessment on the validity of Nellie's account while you're reading. She very clearly has a dislike for one of the characters, especially. And that really comes out in the story. She is also not the most sympathetic narrator, let me tell you that much. Probably the most interesting elements of the story are the characters. Everyone is awful, but in a way that's super intriguing. You will likely hate everyone in here, but that makes it easier to keep going. The book explores the themes of love, revenge, class, injustice, generational trauma, all of it. I really loved the imagery surrounding Wuthering Heights, as in the house, not, you know, the book, and Thrushcross Grange, a nearby house. Early in the book, there's this implication that the Heights maybe represents hell and Thrushcross represents heaven, only for these descriptions and these experiences to be flipped on its head for certain characters. I won't say too much more on that, but I loved it, basically. This was a very accessible classic, in my opinion. It wasn't difficult to get into, the prose was nice, but never hard to understand. I would recommend it even if you think classics aren't your thing. It's worth a try, and I will leave you with probably the most iconic Wuthering Heights quote ever. He's more myself than I am. Whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same. Next, I read First Time Caller by B.K. Barson. This is a romance book and I gave it 4.75 stars. This book follows Lucy Stone, a young single mother, and Aidan Valentine, the host of a romantic advice radio show. Lucy is a mechanic who hasn't been on a date in a while, and she also has a 12-year-old daughter. Aidan has started to doubt that love is even real. One night, Lucy hears her daughter on the phone. It turns out that her daughter rang the radio show for advice on how to get a date for Lucy. Lucy and Aidan have this honest, vulnerable conversation about love. This conversation clip then goes viral. The radio station leaders then decide to run a segment on the show all about finding love for Lucy. Basically, that just means that Lucy and Aidan work together on the station to get Lucy a date. She's going to go on dates and report back, talk about it, and listeners can call in and talk to her on air, stuff like that. Through this process, we see Lucy and Aidan start to get closer, and I'm sure you can guess where it goes from there. Something I really liked about this book was the fantastic supporting cast. We have Lucy's daughter, the dad, and the dad's current partner. The relationships between all of these characters was really nice to read. All of them really care about each other. You can literally feel the love from this little family through the pages of the book. I found these relationships interesting because you don't generally see them handled like this in books, especially romance books. Like, the ex is usually cartoonishly evil, so this was really refreshing. I think Aidan was a character that could be a bit frustrating. Communication is this man's biggest weakness. He does not talk about his feelings. But but you can kind of understand why because of his backstory, but it can still get quite exasperating. That being said, I like their dynamic and what was going on in here. There's another book set in the same universe following one of the side characters in here, so I will be reading that. I think Borison's character writing was really strong, and I quite look forward to reading the next one. Next, I read Fearless by Lauren Roberts. This is the final book in a YA fantasy series, and I gave it 3 stars. The Powerless series is finished, and I think the series got worse as it went on. The concept in this universe, you've kind of heard this before, but I'll keep it brief enough. There are elites who have magic, ordinaries who don't. The ordinaries have been hunted and removed from this main kingdom, Ilia. Payden is our ordinary in hiding. Kai is the enforcer. His job is to hunt and kill ordinaries. This series feels very derivative. If you were into YA fantasy in the 2010s, it's likely you've read this book before. There is nothing new in here. It felt like the author maybe had a solid enough plan for the first book, but then kind of didn't have loads of ideas following on from that. Let's talk about this one specifically. The word fearless was used too many times. Can someone check how many times exactly? That's kind of a petty criticism, and I acknowledge that. But it really annoys me when books do this, kind of treating the audience as idiots and being like, hey, look, it's the book title. Look, this book also felt like it was really trying to reclaim that success of the first book. There's a series of trials going on again, and it just felt tired. Speaking of tired, I have to mention Kai. He has become a broken record. His POVs were the same things, the same lines over and over again. There's only so many times you can read some variation of I want Payden without getting fed up. The pacing in here wasn't great. It felt super fast-paced at times and painstakingly slow at others. The twists were mostly predictable, and the ones that I maybe didn't see coming came out of nowhere in a bad way. The best plot twists are the ones you can kind of track throughout the book or series. I think maybe there was like one twist in even this whole series that I didn't see coming, and it wasn't executed well. All in all, Powerful was probably Robert's best novel or novella to date, and I'm kind of glad this series is over. Next, I read Alchemy of Secrets by Stephanie Garber. This is Garber's first adult fantasy novel, and I gave it 3.25 stars. I'm a big fan of Garber's writing. I read the Caraval and Once Upon a Broken Heart series over the last couple years, and I loved them. This one was a bit less engaging. Here's the premise. There is a secret side of Los Angeles that not many people are aware of. Figures from myths and legends are real. Holland, our main character, has always had kind of interest in this darker side of things. Throughout this book, Holland gets pulled further into this world of myths and ends up in life or death situations. I really enjoyed the setting. I've never been overly interested in Hollywood or the film industry, but this book had me intrigued. There was this old-timey feel to the story, even though it was set in 2025. The book was fairly fast-paced, much like all of Garber's work, and I was super curious to find out what was going on. The stakes were also very high, so that kind of added to the intensity of the mystery. As usual, the writing in here was super whimsical. I think that is Garber's strong point. The worlds she writes are intricate and fantastical. This book was set in the real world with that little layer of whimsy on top of it, but there were still 1 or 2 bad points. So for example, the ending was unsatisfying. The book felt like it kind of just ended. All of the curiosity and excitement around the mystery kind of just culminated in a meh ending, and I was just expecting so much more than what we got from it. It was a little disappointing. I also didn't care much for our characters. The love I have for the Caraval characters did not translate across to Holland and the other characters in this book. They felt fairly surface level. That all being said, I will keep reading books that Garber puts out. This was technically a debut since it was her first adult book, so I imagine they'll get better as she gets into the universe and gets comfy with the characters. Next, I read If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio. This is a dark academia academia thriller, and I gave it 4 stars. This was an interesting book, not really like anything I've read before. This book is highly influenced by a selection of Shakespearean plays. I would say Julius Caesar and Macbeth are the most important ones. The book follows a group of students studying at a creative arts university. The main characters are all 4th year drama students. They speak almost exclusively in Shakespearean quotes, so be ready for that. At the start of the book, we see Oliver, the main character, pretty much, being released from prison for the murder of one of his classmates. Over the course of the book, we get Oliver retelling his story on what happened. At this point, we don't even know which student died. I won't spoil it, don't worry. And we are basically getting to the bottom of the mystery and also finding out where our characters are now. A basic understanding of the Shakespearean plays referenced in here is probably best, especially for grasping the dynamics between the characters, because the students really do fall into the character archetypes from the plays. And when roles get swapped, we really see the students conforming to these roles, both on and off the stage. I did read some of the plays mentioned and quoted in here, so I found the character motivations and personalities quite easy to follow. Shakespearean girlies are going to love this one. Non-Shakespearean girlies can still like it too, though. The mystery at the heart of this, like, did Oliver do this, really kept the suspense high. We also see the fallout and the descent of all of the characters once one of their cohort is killed. It's interesting to see each of the characters' different reactions to such a horrible thing happening. There's also like a hint of, is Oliver telling the truth? You have to decide how much you trust his account. I do really recommend this, though it is a bit more of an autumnal book, so maybe save it for later in the year. The final book I'm going to talk about today is The Second Death of Locke by V.L. Bovalino. This is a fantasy book and I gave it 5 stars. Here we are, my first 5-star of the year. This book was impossible to put down. So, our magic system. In this world, there are mages and wells. Mages can use magic, but they can't actually store any, like they don't have any. Whereas wells have magic, but they cannot use it. Enter Gray and Kier. Gray is Kier's well. She would do anything for him. Meanwhile, he's like this big superstar, powerful magic wielder. This world is in a constant state of war. Years ago, the magical island of Locke disappeared in a blaze of fire, taking the powerful Locke family with it. Ever since that happened, no new wells have been born. Locke was the source of all magic, and it is implied that it's not completely destroyed and an heir might have gotten away. Hypothetically, if this heir was to die, magic would cease to exist. Gray and Kier are tasked with transporting a young girl who claims to be the heir of Locke. They're bringing her to like the head of the army. From there, we get like a quest book with our little band of misfits. I loved the characters in this book. Shout out to the non-binary and trans characters in the main cast. We love to see that type of representation in our fantasy books, especially in the way that the author portrays them and that their gender identities are not the only important thing about the characters. The relationship dynamics between everyone was really fantastic, especially our main romantic subplot. You can tell the author really appreciates physical affection as a love language in this book, and it just comes off as super sweet. There were points where I was afraid the plot was going to go down like a certain avenue and I was a bit iffy about it, but then the author wouldn't do what I was dreading, which was a massive relief. This also happens to be the first book in the universe, but it's not really a series per se. The next book will be following different characters with potential cameos from some of the characters in here. I shall be reading that next book. I like this book enough to follow the author on Instagram. That's how serious it was for me. And there we go. All of the books I read in the first 3 months of 2026. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, here's another one that YouTube recommends for you, and I will see you next time.